Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 5 running back rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with the waiver wire. We'll talk about some of the running backs that I mentioned on yesterday's video and how in the last 24 hours, a lot of their situations have changed and how we're going to reprioritize them going into tonight. Then after that, we'll move on to the running back conversation, beginning with matchups for Week 5 in order to give ourselves more of an insight as to who has the most advantageous matchups going into Week 5. Again, the two biggest benefactors of matchups last week were Rashaad Penny and Austin Ekeler. And there's a reason why they were two of the best backs at the end of the week is because they were playing up against the easiest strength of schedule defenses going into the week based on the running back position. Then after we talk about matchups, we'll then transition to our top 36 running back rankings as I'll share with you guys statistics that justify the reasons as to how I have the position ranked going into Week 5 in order to help you guys out. Be sure to go ahead, take 2 seconds out of your day and subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season with the singular goal of trying to help you win your weekly matchups and a 2022 fantasy football championship. So be sure to do yourself a favor and do me a favor because we are on our way to our goal of 70,000 subscribers. We're very close to reaching said goal. So if you can help us get there, that'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about waiver wire running backs first and foremost. Again, yesterday we had Mike Boone on the thumbnail and he was my number one running back that I wanted to mention. I do want to, of course, say that I did call it. Latavius Murray is going to be transitioned from the New Orleans Saints practice squad now that he has been signed by the Denver Broncos. So that presents another running back in that offense that probably moves Mike Boone down on the overall totem pole in terms of overall opportunities on a weekly basis. It'll probably still remain Melvin Gordon number 1, followed by now Latavius Murray number 2, and Mike Boone number 3. There may be more of a committee situation in which, of course, Mike Boone may take some third round reps while some other guys may have the early reps going forward in a singular drive. But as of this current moment in time, we're going to go ahead and we're going to have Tyler Allgeier as the number 1 overall back that we want to prioritize going into Week 5. Now, this is under the assumption that Brian Robinson Jr. is not available. I know he was rostered in about 54% of leagues on Yahoo. He may be available. If he is, you might want to look into that. That's probably a better option rest of season. Of course, so Tyler Allgeier will be number 1, followed by Raheem Mostert number 2, Latavius Murray number 3, and then we could talk about Mike Boone, Rachaad White. I'd probably rather have Rachaad White at that point. Mike Boone pretty much falls to the bottom of the list, and we're swapping positions from yesterday's video. So again, from the top, Tyler Allgeier, followed by Raheem Mostert, Latavius Murray, Rachaad White, and then we could talk about Mike Boone at the very end. That's pretty much it. Giving you guys a little bit of a rundown, obviously due to the signing of Latavius Murray on the Denver Broncos, definitely does make a huge difference in the long run at the position. Okay, now that we've covered that, let's transition to our conversation regarding matchups for Week 5. As you can see immediately to the right of me, we have how many points defenses have been giving up to opposing running backs in a half PPR scoring format. Again, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or in a full PPR league, but giving you some perspective as to which defenses have given up the most points on a weekly basis through weeks 1 through 4. Of course, we can see the Houston Texans, Detroit Lions, Los Angeles Chargers, they have given up a boatload of points across the board. Some of them through the air, some of them on the ground. Of course, the Detroit Lions have already given up 8 rushing touchdowns to opposing running backs. While on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Los Angeles Rams, San Francisco 49ers, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, New England Patriots, pretty stout against the run, and of course being able to stop opposing running backs from scoring, whether it is on the ground or through the air. But like I've mentioned in prior weeks, what I typically try to focus on in terms of running back matchups is how many points defenses are giving up on the ground to rushing statistics alone. All the data that I've collected over the last couple years emphasizes that there is no correlation between receiving work and a defensive matchup. So if a team prefers to target their running backs out of the backfield, regardless of whether it is an easy or difficult matchup based on how many points they have given up, it does not actually play a role in the grand scheme. Therefore, we go ahead and we isolate rushing statistics allowed by defenses, finding that the Detroit Lions, Houston Texans, Seahawks have given up the most points in rushing statistics alone that only isolate rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. So for those of you who play in a standard league, this kind of does present a little bit more of an upside as to what exactly we're looking at, but ultimately this should help across the board. Nonetheless, we'll be referring back to these statistics as we go out through today's video, just to kind of give you an idea as to who has the most advantageous matchups throughout the week. Of course, we designate said matchups with a star rating, 1 star being the most difficult possible matchup you could face within a given week, while 5 star is the best matchup. And of course, we are starting said players. So with all that mentioned, let's go ahead and transition into our top 36 running back rankings conversation, beginning with the new number 1 Of course, last week we had Saquon. The week before we had Jonathan Taylor. But Saquon Barkley now has the throne. He is going to be the #1 running back that I'm projecting for this given week, taking on the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, of course, Nick Chubb is coming off of 3 consecutive incredible weeks of fantasy football, having scored a touchdown in each of those 3 weeks. Not only that, already this season, he has been putting up a minimum of 113 total yards per game. That in itself just goes ahead and it solidifies 11 fantasy points for his total. And the fact that he's continuing to score touchdowns and getting a lot of opportunity down in the red zone makes him a fantastic fantasy option. This upcoming week, they take on the Los Angeles Chargers. He had a privilege of taking them on last season. In that matchup, Nick Chubb had 23.5 half PPR fantasy points and had an incredible performance. That is why I've designated it a 4-star performance, as this team has given up a fair share of points from rushing statistics alone. Not only that, at this current moment in time, the Los Angeles Chargers lead the league in terms of giving up the most yards per carry on average to opposing running backs, an average of 6.08 per carry. That in itself is unbelievable. We're, of course, starting our Cleveland running backs, but primarily Nick Chubb. Moving on to our number 2, we have Derrick Henry taking on the Washington Commanders. Derrick Henry, over the last 2 weeks, has looked like the workhorse running back that I projected that he was going to be. I know many of you were kind of worried early on in the season, but like I mentioned, I told many of you, if you have an opportunity to go ahead and trade for Derrick Henry, you should go ahead and do so, because they're going to more or less look to give him 25 to 30 touches per game rather than the opposite end of that spectrum, which is exactly what they've done in the last 2 weeks, having given him 26 and 27 opportunities in the last 2 games. Not only that, in the last 2 games, he has had 11 targets that have led to 8 receptions, 91 receiving yards. Those kind of totals for Derrick Henry of all running backs is only going to make him that much more valuable in half PPR, full PPR formats going forward. That level of opportunity and production in the receiving game makes him one of the most explosive backs and high upside backs in fantasy football, because he has now unlocked that spectrum of the game. If you're able to add those kind of numbers to Nick Chubb's totals, imagine what we get out of that. That's a top 5 every single year, every single week probably at that point. Either way, Derrick Henry, as long as they're giving him opportunity, he has a relatively favorable matchup going against the Washington Commanders this week. They're going to hand him the ball. He's going to find success. Don't forget, even this last week, despite the fact that he only put up 22 points, he had an 18-yard rushing touchdown called back on a holding. It was one of the best runs of the year. If you haven't seen it, check it out. Moving on, we have Saquon Barkley as our number 3, taking on the Green Bay Packers in London. Again, do not forget to set your lineups before the London game, and maybe even wake up before the London game, because from our past week's experiences, many of us were burnt, but we'll talk about that in just a bit. Let's talk about Saquon Barkley right now, taking on the Green Bay Packers. It is a favorable matchup in my opinion. Of course, we just saw Damien Harris and Rhamondre Stevenson have a field day with a 3rd-string quarterback under center for that team. If you have a team that is committed to running the ball, of course, you're going to find success regardless against who you play. And that's exactly what the New York Giants have hanged their hat on all season long. At this moment, we're coming off of a week in which Saquon Barkley had 31 rushing attempts. Already this season, he leads all running backs in rushing attempts with 84 total. That kind of level of opportunity is second to none. And as long as he continues to maintain that level of production, of course, we're expecting great success in terms of fantasy point productivity from Saquon Barkley on a weekly basis. I know there's a conversation as to Tyrod Taylor being concussed and Daniel Jones dealing with an ankle injury. If they're going to go ahead and play Davis Webb this upcoming week, it may scare us away from Saquon, but for many of us, we don't have an alternative option. We got to start him and hope for the best. Moving on to Austin Ekeler, the thumbnail for today's video. Taking on the Cleveland Browns, it is a 5-star matchup in my opinion, as this team has given up nearly 16 fantasy points per game on the ground thus far this season. Now, last season, he took on the Cleveland Browns and found himself a lot of success, in fact. You know, he had himself a 30.4 fantasy point game in a half PPR scoring format. I mean, luckily for him, and many of us, he's coming off of a 31.9 fantasy point performance against the Houston Texans defense, who, of course, gave up 3 touchdowns to Austin Ekeler. But I do want to put this in perspective. We anticipated Austin Ekeler to get back on track. We mentioned it. You can only contain so much talent for so long until it finally explodes. And now I'm expecting Austin Ekeler to be what he was last year, getting a lot of touches, getting a lot of opportunities, and going forward with a lot of fantasy point productivity. Now, in terms of what we've seen in the last couple weeks that kind of defines him, of course, the touchdowns from this last week were incredible, but the amount of receptions that Austin Ekeler has already garnered this season is unbelievable. He is 6th amongst all players in the National Football League in total receptions this season. He has a total of 27. Just to put it in perspective, Devontae Adams only has 26 total receptions right now. Austin Ekeler is getting opportunity not only on the ground, but in the air, and as long as that's going to be a key factor within his overall weekly base, he's going to have a lot of upside, especially in this great matchup. Moving on to Christian McCaffrey. Speaking of getting a lot of opportunity through the air, Christian McCaffrey is coming off of a week where our prayers were heard. The fantasy gods finally blessed us as Baker Mayfield finally decided, you know what? Maybe I should throw to Christian McCaffrey. Maybe he's actually a good receiver. 9 targets, 9 catches. Christian McCaffrey was able to get it done in garbage time and was able to garner not only those 9 receptions, but 81 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. This upcoming week, they do take on the San Francisco 49ers, which is one of the toughest matchups in the league. But as long as he's continuing to get a lot of receiving work, of course, we're expecting Christian McCaffrey to take that next step. Now, a couple promising stats that we saw from this last week was the fact that Christian McCaffrey ran the most routes that he has in a singular game this season when he played against the Arizona Cardinals last week. If that's going to continue to trend in the right direction, more routes run will potentially lead to more potential targets, more receiving yards, more fantasy points. That's what we're expecting. Of course, he takes on the 49ers, but even if he's not able to get much production on the ground, don't forget last week, only 8 carries for 27 yards. The rushing work isn't that much of a, kind of deal breaker for him. If anything, that's where we're going to get our overall upside. Our base floor is going to be from his receiving work. Moving on, let's talk about Jonathan Taylor. He does play on Thursday night, if in fact he is even going to play. We'll talk about Nyheim Hines a little bit later in today's episode, as I do have him in my top 36 rankings, but it's purely going to be a matter of whether or not Jonathan Taylor plays. What we heard earlier today from head coach Frank Reich of the Indianapolis Colts was that Jonathan Taylor isn't ready right now, but they're going to go ahead and see if he can go on Thursday. That isn't promising. That is not a great sign. They obviously tested his ankle just to make sure there wasn't any damage to ligaments or anything. I'm not a doctor, but they just wanted to make sure that it wasn't anything long-term, that if in fact he was to play on Thursday, he could re-aggravate and make it even worse. That may end up, holding him out for an even longer period of time rather than a week. As of this current moment, everything that I've heard is that, even if he plays, there's very little potential risk for further damage. But they may just want to protect him. They're a 1-3 football team, and yes, they need this win, but maybe they want to go ahead and protect him for the future weeks. If in fact he plays, of course, he's Jonathan Taylor. We have to have him in our starting lineup, especially after what Josh Jacobs just did to this Denver Broncos front seven. I'm expecting a lot of success as long as he's available for us this upcoming Thursday night. Moving on to James Robinson, our number 7. James Robinson had himself a very underwhelming week, and we pretty much anticipated that. There's a reason why I had him outside of my top 12 last week. Even though many of you in the comment section were saying, Andrew, you got to have him in our top 12. You got to put some respect on the name. I will put respect on the name when it is deservedly so in that given week. We're not ranking overall, for the rest of the season. I'm ranking within singular weeks. And going into this week, he's got the best matchup at the running back position. Literally. Taking on the Houston Texans, a team that has given up 21.6 points per game on rushing stats alone. Rushing yardage and rushing touchdowns within the first 4 weeks of the season. Now, of course, James Robinson has found some success against that defense over the last couple of years, and he himself is going to be unleashed in this week's matchup. But when you look at the Texans as a whole, the fact that they've given up 29.9 fantasy points per game in terms of all rushing stats combined, that opens up work for Travis Etienne to get himself, potentially 10 fantasy points with an upside week, while we still see James Robinson get 20 plus in this given contest. I'm expecting a great performance. He only played about 47% of the snaps last week against the Philadelphia Eagles. That wasn't really much of a surprise. Tougher matchup, negative game script. Going forward, especially this week, we expect a huge performance from James Robinson. Moving on to Jamaal Williams. Speaking of another running back that has been incredible as of late, he does take on the New England Patriots, but, in 3 of the 4 games this season already, this touchdown machine has scored 2 touchdowns. 75% of the time, he's scoring not 1, but 2 touchdowns. Just the statistics alone, the potential for that is just unbelievable. No other running back is doing that because Jamaal Williams is 1 of 1. And in the offense that he's associated with, behind this offensive line, within the scheme, they're getting him a lot of opportunities on that goal line. In fact, already this season, he leads all running backs in terms of rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line, with 8 total rushing attempts that have led to 4 rushing touchdowns. That level of opportunity, if you gave it to any other running back, of course they were going to succeed. But the fact that Jamaal Williams has not only been able to find a lot of success, coming off of a week in which he was averaging 5.7 yards per carry against the Seattle Seahawks, I'm expecting a lot more success going into this upcoming week. We just saw Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon run through this defense. I don't see why Jamaal Williams wouldn't be able to do the same. Moving on, we're talking about Aaron Jones. Speaking of, all right, let's talk about him taking on the New York Giants in London. Now, he's my number 9 running back going into this week, mainly because he has been hyper efficient in the opportunities that he has been given. Not only have we seen Aaron Jones accumulate 3 receptions in every single game this season already, but he's been able to garner, unbelievable. I haven't seen this number in a while. A 6.88 yard per carry average. There have been 3 contests already this season out of the 4 that he has left that game averaging over 6.9 yards per carry. That in itself kind of gives you an indication that, yes, he's been hyper efficient even with not too many touches. They haven't gotten him into that range of like 25 touches. He's not that kind of a running back as they're splitting carries with A.J. Dillon. But the fact that he's been so efficient, all he really does need is the ever-elusive touchdown. And we know Aaron Jones is a touchdown machine. So it's only a matter of time where those touchdowns rack up with the fact that this guy's running for almost 7 yards per carry. And those numbers eclipse and get to a completely another level. That is what I'm expecting this week against the Giants front 7. Aaron Jones to find a lot of success. Moving on to Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I give up. Clyde Edwards is the deal. I don't know what to tell you. Clyde Edwards has proven me wrong every single step I have taken. I rank him low, he plays better. I tell you to trade him, he plays even better. I don't know what to tell you. At this point, I've bought the hype. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is getting the touches, he's getting the work done, and he's finding the end zone. And quite frankly, the end zone is all that matters. And as long as he's going to continue to be in that conversation, by all means, we have to start him every single week. He's currently my number 10 running back, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, who in my opinion serve as a pretty good matchup for him, mainly because when we have seen the Kansas City Chiefs take on the Las Vegas Raiders over the last 4 years, already the statistic is pretty crazy, but the Kansas City Chiefs have won in 7 out of the last 8 games. Okay, that's pretty favorable for Patrick Mahomes and this Chiefs offense. But not only that, when you go back to last season's games against the Las Vegas Raiders, the Kansas City Chiefs won a total of 89-23 in those 2 games. 89 points to 23. Absolute blowout performances that we have seen. Not only that, when you go back to the last 2 games that Clyde Edwards-Helaire has played against the Las Vegas Raiders, in both those games, he has scored 2 touchdowns. Hey, does that look familiar to what he's been doing recently? Absolutely. Was he able to, run for 92 yards on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers front 7? Absolutely. Hey, at this point, I'm all in. I'm playing him as my number 10. Moving on to Joe Mixon or number 11. Hey, many of us realized after that Thursday Night Football game, while I was live streaming here on the channel again, hopefully we'll be able to do that this week once again after Thursday Night Football, live streaming here. Joe Mixon should have had 3 rushing touchdowns last week. The fact that this offense is just so poor in the red zone is just unfortunate. The blocking up front was terrible. Joe Mixon didn't look great this past weekend in terms of his burst. Of course, he was still dealing with that injury from the prior week Sunday. It was a short week on that Thursday night, so I don't really blame him, but very easily could have had himself a 30-point fantasy performance against the Miami Dolphins defense, which is quite frankly one of the better run-stopping defenses in the National Football League, and we were able to witness that considering their goal line defense was so strong. Nonetheless, we're continuing to see Joe Mixon get a lot of utilization in the receiving game. As long as those numbers are there, we're of course going to see him get 20+ touches per game on the ground and the majority, if not all, of the red zone opportunities. This upcoming week, they take on the Baltimore Ravens. Last season, in the 2 games that he played against the Baltimore Ravens in a half PPR, put up 11.9 and 28.5. The blowouts between those 2 contests last season, the Cincinnati Bengals put up 41 offensive points in both those games against the Baltimore Ravens defense last year. This is going to be a one-sided affair, maybe, unless Lamar Jackson has something to say. We could very easily see a shootout where everyone is scoring a bunch of points, which we're hoping for. Moving on, we have Dalvin Cook as the final RB1 that we wanted to mention on today's video. Dalvin Cook takes on the Chicago Bears. Dalvin Cook, very interesting scenario here. Of course, he hasn't really been given a lot of touchdown potential, even though he's been given a great amount of touches. In fact, outside of the singular game against the Philadelphia Eagles where he wasn't given much touches, the rest of the games consist of 17 touches, 23 touches, and 22 touches. Of course, if we're going to be in that level, in that conversation, eventually the touchdowns are going to, kind of join us. But when you compare him to the other running backs thus far this season, he only has 1 rushing attempt inside the 5-yard line. And yes, that has led to a touchdown, but outside of that, nothing. And I'm purely expecting to get back on track, especially against the Chicago Bears defense. They're a 4-star matchup. They've given up a fair share of points on the ground. We're not even talking about the receiving potential of Dalvin Cook. Purely on rushing statistics alone, he should very easily be able to match that number on screen in terms of that average that they've been giving up to opposing running backs thus far this season on average. In my opinion, Dalvin Cook, a top 12 option. Speaking of our top 12, let's go ahead and throw them on the screen as of this current moment in time. we have our top 12. Do not forget, we have rankings subject to change. We are going to have a live stream Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning. Again, the Sunday morning live stream, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, called Kickoff with Kirchhoff. We'll have up-to-date rankings for our top 36 running backs, wide receivers, top 16 tight ends, and quarterbacks available to you on screen in order to help you guys out setting your lineups before kickoff. So be sure to join us. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the RB2 conversation, beginning with Leonard Fournette. Leonard Fournette is coming off a week in which he had 3 carries for -3 yards. That is quite concerning. He hasn't really looked the same since his hamstring injury has kind of presented itself early on in the season. In fact, hasn't really looked the same since week 1. And that was against the Dallas Cowboys, where he had over 100 rushing yards and the offensive line was fully healthy. And since we have seen this offense kind of fall apart due to the injuries that they have sustained, it looks to me like Leonard Fournette is in a position where maybe, just maybe, he's not going to have a big impact on the ground unless he's on the goal line. And even then, just this last week, when they were on the goal line, they handed it off to Rachaad White. I'm expecting him to get a lot of utilization as a receiving threat. And sure, he's going to get his 10 to 12 rushing attempts. But if we end up finishing with 50 rushing yards, the biggest difference maker is going to be whether or not he is getting a touchdown and whether or not he is in the conversation of the receiving work for this offense, especially if it's a blowout and the competition isn't really there in the second half. As of the last 2 years, in the 4 games that he's played against the Atlanta Falcons, he's averaged 13.0 fantasy points per game. We're thinking about similar numbers in that regard. Moving on to Alvin Kamara, number 14. Now, the hope is that Alvin Kamara plays. Now, for many of you who obviously dealt with the situation that occurred last Sunday morning, in which an hour before kickoff, the New Orleans Saints went ahead, made him inactive, and pretty much screwed many of us because we were either asleep or not paying attention in that regard. Nonetheless, last time he took on the Seattle Seahawks defense was last year. In that contest, we saw Alvin Kamara have 28.9 fantasy points. I mean, not only is that great thing to see, considering we've found success against that defense and the game plan is probably going to be very similar considering the offensive coordinator is the same. But the fact that just recently, the Seattle Seahawks, they gave up a bunch of points to Jamaal Williams. Jamaal Williams went for over 100 rushing yards, had himself 2 rushing touchdowns this past Sunday. In fact, just the Detroit Lions alone, 45 offensive points. When you're putting up that many points, it gives me a lot of confidence that the Saints can get back on track with a healthy Alvin Kamara and make a breakout week here in week 5. Moving on to Damien Harris on number 15. Speaking of the Lions, they are the worst defense in terms of stopping the run thus far this season. Every single team that has played against them has found success. Quite literally every single team. There's a reason why Rashaad Penny, who was literally worth pennies just moments ago, was able to completely turn around his season with a singular game, playing against the Detroit Lions. Now, Damien Harris has an incredible opportunity this week. Despite the fact that Damien Harris has already proven to us that he is a valuable commodity in fantasy, coming off of 3 consecutive weeks of 10 plus fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format, he has a beautiful chance of taking on a defense that, quite frankly, doesn't exist. When we think about the defense for the Detroit Lions, they cannot stop receivers, they cannot stop tight ends, they cannot stop running backs. So anything is going to work in this scenario, even if we're talking about Zappe, the 3rd string rookie quarterback, being under center once again this week. I'm expecting Damien Harris to get a lot of rushing attempts, similar to last week, 18 rushing attempts, and even to be able to split touches with Rhamondre Stevenson, and both of them find a lot of success in said matchup. Moving on, we have Dameon Pierce, who's been incredible as a rookie running back, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars defense, who has given up their fair share of points, mainly because of Miles Sanders this past weekend, really running through that defense behind one of the best offensive lines in the league. Now, Dameon Pierce is coming off of a performance in which he put up 22.9 half PPR fantasy points, had himself a 75-yard rushing touchdown. When I went back and I was watching the film prior to today's video, holy moly, everyone made a perfect block on that play. And he went ahead, he utilized his speed, and got to the end zone. As of the last couple weeks, he has seen elite levels of running back opportunity, especially this past weekend in which he saw 6 targets that led to 6 receptions. In the last 2 weeks already, he's had 20 plus touches in both games. If we're going to be in this conversation of giving him 20 plus touches every single week, and the team is bought into the idea of Dameon Pierce being this guy for the team, I'm expecting a lot of success to continue to go forward with him. Even though the 75-yard touchdown does kind of skew in the opposite direction, he still would have been 10 plus points in the week, and we're expecting very easily to have a baseline floor of 10 plus fantasy points with the potential upside of getting to that next level. Moving on to Khalil Herbert. Under the assumption that David Montgomery actually does not play this week due to the ankle injury that he sustained a couple weeks back, of course, we're anticipating that Khalil Herbert should be a decent running back. Coming off of a week in which he played 77% of the offensive snaps, of course, even with David Montgomery not in the lineup, they're going to continue to run a 2-back threat, not to kind of over-encumber one running back with too many touches. So he's coming off a week in which he had a total of 20 touches, 19 on the ground, 1 through the air, had himself over 100 total yards, and that seems like a pretty good week. Unfortunately, wasn't able to find the end zone, and if he was able to, we would have had ourselves a fantastic fantasy point performance. Now, going forward, they take on the Minnesota Vikings. In my opinion, if we can see Latavius Murray come off the practice squad and roll through this defense, I'm expecting Khalil Herbert to be able to do something very similar, especially considering he's younger, stronger, faster, all of that. Nonetheless, the whole question is whether or not Justin Fields is going to allow them to get to that level. Unfortunately, Justin Fields, even though he may have had a little bit of a better week in terms of like total overall yardage, wasn't that much better. 11 of 22 passing. That is not going to cut it. Luckily, the Minnesota Vikings, they've allowed 90 plus rushing yards to every single team's opposing running backs thus far this season, and we're expecting a lot of success for Herbert. Moving on, we have Breece Hall, another rookie running back that we wanted to mention. Breece Hall is coming off of an incredible week, which he was crowned the lead back of this offense. 17 rushing attempts, 6 targets, a total of 14.8 fantasy points, and was able to get himself into the end zone. That in itself is all I have to say. In terms of total touches, between the backfield, Breece Hall dominating 23 total opportunities in comparison to Michael Carter's 12 total opportunities. If we're going to continue to see this distribution of opportunity, expect Breece Hall to be that RB2 that we anticipated him to be, with potential RB1 upside. I know the Miami Dolphins matchup is one of the toughest in the league right now, but ultimately, he is a must-start player going into this week. Moving on to Rhamondre Stevenson with an incredible matchup, which I mentioned just moments ago with Damien Harris. The Detroit Lions, they're giving up a boatload of points to opposing running backs. Not only have they given up 8 rushing touchdowns already, they've given up a total of, let me go ahead and read these one by one. In week 1 to the Eagles running backs, 126 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns. To the Commanders, 37 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown. The Vikings, 124 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. Against the Seattle Seahawks this last week, 180 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns allowed. What more do I have to say? Rhamondre Stevenson, who has gotten himself 16 and 18 opportunities each of the last 2 weeks, he's getting himself receiving work, rushing work, and he's becoming the running back I anticipated him to be. As of right now, he's an RB2 in my mind, especially in an incredible matchup. Moving on to Miles Sanders, who had himself an incredible week. The amount of fantasy points he put up was shocking, but I'll take it. I'm not going to complain about it. I had a couple weeks leagues where I had him playing, and he had himself a 28.6 point fantasy point performance. And if we're going to see those kind of numbers, those levels of opportunities, 27 rushing attempts, obviously due to the weather, he got himself a lot of utilization on the ground, but he also was able to get himself 3 targets, 2 catches, 22 receiving yards. If he's going to continue to be an all-around back, stay healthy within this offense behind one of the best offensive lines in the league, if he's going to continue to see these kind of levels of opportunities, especially in a upcoming matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, I think the game script is going to be relatively run-heavy, and I'll tell you exactly why. Thus far this season, in the first 4 games of the year, the Arizona Cardinals have literally scored 0 points in the first quarter. They have only scored 16 points in the second quarter, which is an average of 4 points per quarter in the second. So that in itself gives me a lot of confidence that the Eagles mount a very early lead, and once they do, run the ball late with Miles Sanders. Moving on, we have Jeff Wilson Jr. as our number 21. He looked great last night. Had himself a huge run for a touchdown, and for 3 consecutive weeks has been putting up 10 plus fantasy points. That in itself, that kind of level of consistency, that's all I need to see. Has a great matchup going against the Carolina Panthers run-stopping defense, which, yes, at times have been great, at times have been poor. I think this is a matter of just skill and scheme that is going to be implemented against that defense that will find success, even with some of the offensive linemen beat up for the San Francisco 49ers, specifically Trent Williams. I still think this is going to be a fantastic matchup and a great outcome for Jeff Wilson Jr. against them. Let's not forget, Deebo Samuel in the last 2 games has only had himself 8 rushing yards in the opportunities he's been given. They're beginning to phase him out in that opportunity, which is only leading to more touches for Jeff Wilson Jr. Moving on to J.K. Dobbins, who is coming off of a major week of 2 touchdowns and 20 fantasy points. J.K. Dobbins is slowly but surely being granted the opportunities that he deserves to be the RB1 of this team. It's just a matter of how comfortable are the Ravens giving him touches, and how comfortable is he with the recovery process that he has made from the ACL. Of course, 13 total rushing attempts, 4 targets, 4 catches. I mean, those kind of touches alone is obviously going to lead to a lot of points, especially when we're talking about an offense like the Baltimore Ravens, who are number 3 in the National Football League in points per game, 29.8 points per game on average for the Baltimore Ravens offense. Yes, they're taking on the Cincinnati Bengals run-stopping defense, but I'm 100% confident in the idea. This offense knows how to execute their scheme to the highest potential, and they're exactly going to show us in a game in which, honestly, could be a shootout between these two teams in the AFC North. Moving on, we're talking about James Conner. James Conner's been relatively underwhelming, mainly because he's not scoring touchdowns. This season already, inside the 10-yard line, he only has 6 rushing attempts for 1 rushing touchdown. If we were going ahead and seeing him, 6 rushing attempts for 4 rushing touchdowns, we'd have no complaints at this point. We, in fact, would see James Conner as a top 5 fantasy running back, which he was late last season because of the isolation of him in his backfield. But as of late, we really haven't seen anything to move the needle in terms of his overall upside. Yes, he's getting a couple catches, but Benjamin is getting involved. Darrell Williams is still there. And now that he goes up against the Philadelphia Eagles run-stopping defense, I know they've given up their fair share of points based on the early, matchup, week 1 against DeAndre Swift and Jamaal Williams, who poured on a lot of points, but don't let that fantasy point per game allowed number fool you. This is an extremely difficult matchup, and I'm expecting James Conner to have his hands full and potentially be phased out of the overall matchup if they're not able to score early and often. Moving on to Josh Jacobs. Speaking of getting outscored and being kind of phased out of the overall scheme of the game, I'm expecting that to happen to Josh Jacobs, even though he is coming off of a week in which he scored quite literally 32 fantasy points off of an incredible 144 rushing yards, a 5.14 yard per carry average against the Denver Broncos. I am unfortunately thinking that this is not going to sustain another week. We're most likely going to see ourselves in a contest where the Kansas City Chiefs show up and show out and put up a boatload of points. Again, last season in the 2 games that they took on the Las Vegas Raiders, they won 89-23 in terms of total points scored versus total points allowed. That in itself gives me a lot of confidence in the idea that Josh Jacobs may be taking a little bit of a step back this week. Let's not forget, the Kansas City Chiefs have won 7 out of the last 8 matchups against the Las Vegas Raiders. And if that is going to be the case, especially considering what we saw last year from Josh Jacobs in this matchup, only scoring 6.1 and 7.5 half PPR fantasy points, I'm expecting a difficult matchup against a team that scores a lot of points to force Josh Jacobs to have to get a lot of receptions to be relevant. Luckily, in the last 2 weeks already, he's seen a lot of upside in terms of targets and receptions, and that may be able to hold him out as a bottom-end RB2, but that's going to have to make a big difference in order to get him to the levels that we're expecting. All right, so let's go ahead and put these rankings on screen. Our number 13 through 24 running backs going into week 5. Do not forget these rankings are subject to change as the week progresses. There are injury news, whether it is offensive line, whether it's these given players, or maybe defenders that may change their overall rankings. Be sure to join us Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Kick off with Kurikoff, as we'll be talking about our updated rankings that will be on screen, ready to help you out. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about our number 25 overall running back. It is Devin Singletary taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers. It is a favorable matchup. And though the Pittsburgh Steelers haven't given up many yards per carry thus far this season, they have still given up their fair share of points to opposing running backs, which gives me a lot of excitement. I think the Pittsburgh Steelers have been ran on by running backs 113 times. That has led to 445 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. In itself, I'm thinking, okay, if Kenny Pickett is going to be the starting quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he's not the real deal, and he's not able to compete against this Buffalo Bills defense, it is going to be a lot of opportunities for Devin Singletary in this offense to run the ball, throw him the ball out of the backfield like we've seen in the last 2 weeks. I think Devin Singletary has gotten himself 16 targets in the last 2 weeks. That has led to 13 catches, over 130 receiving yards. Those kind of numbers are incredible, and we're hoping that this potentially continues as his opportunity totals have gone to 18 and 15 in the last 2 weeks. But as of right now, I'm expecting this to be a one-sided affair. Hopefully, Devin Singletary finds the end zone for us and gets us to that next level at the running back position. Moving on to Rashaad Penny. Now, even though Rashaad Penny was going to have a great week in week 4, that doesn't mean that's going to potentially carry on in week 5. Unfortunately, he does take on the New Orleans Saints. They've given up their fair share of points to opposing running backs, but I do want to mention maybe there is a little bit of an upside to the performance he had last week that may carry on. Maybe it gives the team more confidence to give him more touches on a weekly basis. Of course, this last week we didn't see any DJ Dallas, we didn't see any Travis Homer. It was just purely Rashaad Penny and Kenneth Walker in that backfield. And Kenneth Walker wasn't very efficient, didn't get anything done. It was all Rashaad Penny. And quite frankly, Rashaad Penny got everything done in the second half already. So, in my opinion, this is probably a player we want to sell high. Go ahead, move him off your team after this 28-point performance and try to sell the idea that, hey, Rashaad Penny is back to what he looked like late last season. Maybe you want to buy him off me and take him off my roster, take him off my hands, and give me another player that is going to benefit me for the future rather than the current week. At this moment, that's what I'm looking at. That's what I'm anticipating. It may not be one of these games where he's able to score a touchdown. It may be a game similar to weeks 1 through 3 where he gets himself 14 rushing attempts, but isn't able to find the end zone, which defines his week as an RB3 performance. Moving on to Najee Harris. Now, many of you may have been wondering, where is Najee Harris, Andrew? How is he in the RB3 conversation? Well, he's played like an RB3. Let's be honest. He hasn't scored touchdowns. Even just this last week, didn't get a single target out of the backfield. And if that's going to continue to be the case, I cannot trust Najee Harris as someone that I have to keep in my roster every single week. And yes, I drafted him as a first-round running back, and I'm expecting him to have first-round running back potential upside. But quite frankly, in this matchup with a backup quarterback who is a rookie, who is going to be in his first start, it does concern me a lot as to what exactly we're going to see out of Najee Harris. Now, hopefully Kenny Pickett, instead of running the ball, is going to start dumping it off to Najee Harris, but we can't guarantee that. And considering there is no guarantee in that factor, I'm expecting to see a little bit of a lesser performance. Yes, he's going to be on the field. Yes, he's going to get rushing attempts. But if a touchdown isn't going to accompany his performance and receiving yards are not going to be there to upscale that, I'm worried. Moving on to Kareem Hunt, our number 28. Now, last time he took on the Los Angeles Chargers, 2021, he had 23.4 fantasy points. Now, that was great and all, but unfortunately, Kareem Hunt in the last couple weeks has not been able to find the end zone once again like he did in week 1. And that in itself has pretty much rendered him to being, a 7-point running back. Until he goes ahead and finds the end zone, which he certainly has an opportunity of doing so this week, considering the Los Angeles Chargers, they're giving up an average of 6.08 yards per carry to opposing running backs. That's the most in the National Football League right now. That in itself kind of lends to a potential, well, maybe, just maybe, he can go ahead, total up his overall 50-plus yards that he typically finds, couple catches out of his backfield, 7-8 points, tack on a touchdown, and get himself into the high-end RB2 conversation. We're hoping for it, but as of right now, it is definitely something that is going to be difficult to anticipate considering how much success Nick Chubb has found down in the red zone. Moving on, we have A.J. Dillon. A.J. Dillon got himself a fair amount of touches this last week, 19 total touches. In terms of comparing him to Aaron Jones, we saw a total opportunity count from this past Sunday's game against the New England Patriots as 19 in the favor of A.J. Dillon and 20 in the favor of Aaron Jones. So if we're going to continue to see very similar numbers of that level of a split, especially in this upcoming weekend's matchup where we may see a third-string quarterback for the New York Giants in London, I'm expecting a lot of running. I'm expecting a lot of success. And even though the New England Patriots with a third-string quarterback kind of, pushed them to the limit, went to overtime, I don't think this will be the case this upcoming week taking on the New York Giants, as the run-stopping defense of this team isn't as prominent as the one that Bill Belichick puts forward. Moving on, we have Melvin Gordon as our number 30. Now, he didn't participate in any sort of practice today. They have to go ahead and put an indication or designation on him because they're legally bound to do so. But again, it's only Tuesday. If you're playing on Thursday, you're not practicing at all because you just came off of a Sunday performance. He's dealing with a neck injury. If in fact he's even active, sure, maybe I want to play him. But the fact that he's dealing with a neck injury, has been dealing with fumble issues, and they recently just signed Latavius Murray, I'm leaning towards the idea that he could definitely be an RB3, but he's got to be at a full capacity, getting full levels of opportunity in that range of 15 to 18 for me to trust Melvin Gordon in this weekend's contest. Moving on to our number 31, we have Raheem Mostert taking on the New York Jets. It's a favorable matchup, and Raheem Mostert, like I mentioned earlier this week in the waiver wire episode, is the running back of this team. He's getting the rushing attempts, the running opportunities. Coming off of a week in which he had a total of, a pretty good number, 15 rushing attempts, 69 rushing yards. That in itself is all I need to see from Raheem Mostert. If he ends up getting any sort of opportunity in terms of the red zone, then his overall level of production elevates. As of right now, Chase Edmonds has primarily been the running back in the red zone in terms of the receiving work and the upside that they kind of present there as an additional threat. But as of right now, even without that being potentially present, I'm still expecting a lot of production and opportunity going in the direction of Raheem Mostert, as Teddy Bridgewater will be under center, and I'm sure this team will be looking to run the ball that much more in order to ensure this victory. Moving on to Ezekiel Elliott, our number 32. Again, Ezekiel Elliott is in a tricky situation. In each of the last 3 weeks, he's had himself 15 plus rushing attempts, and that's fantastic and all, but he does take on one of the toughest matchups at the running back position, taking on the LA Rams. That in itself, it does concern me. I know, Jeff Wilson broke out for a major run last night, but over the course of the season already, we have seen this team be pretty good in terms of stopping the run. I am worried about this offense, especially if in fact they're going to be in a scenario where their best overall aspect is just to pass the ball. Of course, we still have Tony Pollard there, but they're so inconsistent in the opportunities that they give Pollard. At this point, I'm leaning in the direction of just keeping him as an RB3, potentially a flex option if I'm desperate enough. He's not getting enough receiving work. He doesn't have Dak there to allow them to get down to the red zone and give him red zone rushing attempt opportunities like we've seen in prior seasons. Once Dak returns, we'll potentially have Zeke at a higher overall ranking in a given week. But at this moment, with Cooper Rush under center, I'm leaning towards him being an RB3. Moving on to Tyler Allgeier, potentially the number one waiver wire pick of the week. If in fact you're picking him up, yes, you have to understand that they do take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I don't care with what Clyde Edwards-Helaire was able to do against them. That was a matter of that team really purely not being able to stop Patrick Mahomes in the passing game and purely having to kind of focus there instead of stopping the run, which of course annihilated their defense. That all being mentioned, Tyler Allgeier isn't a run-first offense. The Atlanta Falcons want to run the ball more than anybody in the league. There's a reason why on Sunday against the Cleveland Browns, they quite literally ran the ball 14 times in a row to win that game. I'm expecting Tyler Allgeier to be the lead back with Cordero Patterson on the injured reserve, and that is why he sits as our number 33. Moving on to Antonio Gibson. I don't know if Brian Robinson is going to for sure play. He's been medically cleared, but they may have him practicing. They may have him limited this week. In that entire conversation, I suppose you can either start Antonio Gibson, Brian Robinson, or even J.D. McKissic. All three of them could very easily have 5 to 7 to 10 point fantasy value in this given week. It's just a matter of how much contributions they get and opportunities they're given. As of right now, Antonio Gibson, considering he has been the veteran in this backfield, I expect him to kind of take the lead in that for this upcoming week. It is a tougher matchup, but ultimately, I have the most confidence in him out of the bunch. Moving on to the final couple running backs, we have Cam Akers. I don't know what to do with Cam Akers. This offense looks terrible. Matthew Stafford isn't doing anything, and that definitely hurts the running game, especially when they're in tougher matchups. I personally believe this is a tough matchup. I know the Dallas Cowboys defense is definitely going to send a pretty heavy pass rush in the direction of Matthew Stafford. Could very easily look like the game we watched last night this upcoming week. And the fact that this team prefers Darrell Henderson as their third down running back and their pass blocking threat, that leads to Cam Akers playing far less in a given week and producing far less. The final option I wanted to mention is Nyheim Hines. If in fact we do not see Jonathan Taylor play, or even if we do see him play, there's a chance that Nyheim Hines is going to continue to be a mainstay in this offense. And if Jonathan Taylor and his ankle is going to be limited in any capacity, Nyheim Hines, as a receiving threat out of this backfield, could very easily finish the game with 5 catches on 6 targets for 50-some-odd yards and a receiving touchdown. It wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility because we've already seen it already this season and in seasons past. Nyheim Hines is a valuable enough running back that I'm considering him as a final RB3 option. Okay, speaking of the RB3s, let's throw them up on screen as we conclude today's video. I want to thank you guys for watching, supporting the channel, subscribing, and of course, commenting down below. If you guys have not yet already, be sure to go ahead and subscribe. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season. Again, I want to thank you guys for watching. I appreciate you guys supporting the channel. Tomorrow, we'll talk about wide receivers. Thursday, we'll have a special episode along with a stream after the Thursday night football game. Friday, we'll have our must starts. Going into the weekend, we'll have live streams. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.